It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This is one of those times in which I have to stop and ask, wait, I haven't talked about A House of Wax on this show? And it turns out that apparently I had 351 other movies and shows to talk about first, I guess. But the story of House of Wax actually has two starting points. First, many don't realize this was a remake. Warner Brothers first made Mystery of the Wax Museum in 1933 as a two-color Technicolor thriller. That film was in turn based on the three-act play by Charles S. Belden called The Waxworks. For this updated release 20 years later, an entire piece of that first film's plot was completely and totally removed, and instead of it being set in a contemporary setting, House of Wax would be set just after the turn of the century in 1902. But beyond that, both of Warner's films have very similar plots and have a lot of actual shared dialogue between the two of them. But the other origin of this film came because of United Artists having a surprise hit the year before, Buona Devil, an adventure film shot in 3D. And Warner Brothers wanted one of those 3D movies themselves and was willing to basically put all the studio behind it, whereas Buona Devil was simply an independent production distributed by UA. House of Wax would go on to use a lot of pretty famous pretty famous shots to expand on the 3D gimmick. And there's one in particular I will definitely be talking about a little bit later. Now, what's funny is that the director of this film, Andre de Toth, was blind in one eye. And you might be wondering, it's like, well, what's so funny about that? Well, that means the guy they hired to make a 3D movie could not see in 3D. Vincent Price, whose career would be sent into overdrive after the success of this film, always claimed that this was one of those great stories in Hollywood. You know, they hired this director, a good director, sure, for a 3D movie, and he could not understand at all what he was filming. Price would say that the Toth would go in to view the dailies and would have zero understanding why everyone was so excited about the 3D shots they captured. Interestingly, though, that element of the Toth's vision disability actually made the film a little bit better. Yes, the gimmicks in play, but since the Toth couldn't fully understand what he was shooting, he focused instead on story elements, the horror, the thriller aspect of it, and of course the characters in the movie itself. And that's one thing that a lot of people really kind of are drawn to with this movie. So I guess that's one of those cases of turning a disability into a strength. Now, audiences really went for the movie too, making a ton of money in its initial release in April 1953, and it remained at the top spot of the box office receipts for 5 weeks. A later re-release in 1971 with the 3D elements all still there and a full ad campaign helped keep the film popular. And then when the 3D craze returned in the early 80s, another re-release came along to capitalize on the trend. And it turned out that this movie is one of the most well-regarded and highest-grossing 3D movies to have ever been made. Now, the movie opens on a stormy night at a wax museum run by Professor Henry Jared, and he's played by Vincent Price. Jared is a talented sculptor who has some pretty serious talent at capturing the likenesses of historical figures. And for those that he didn't necessarily have like pictures of or anything directly to work off of, he still would find inspirations for these characters that really inspired the people who looked at them. Now, Jared is at odds with his business partner, Matthew Burke. Now, Jared prefers the patronage of those who appreciate art, beauty, and history, but Burke wants more showmanship and more sensational attractions. There's another House of Wax that is bringing in a lot more patrons and getting a lot more money because they have more ghastly things on display. But Burke wants to dissolve their partnership. So anticipating this, Jared has invited a fairly rich art critic to a private showing of his work. And he thinks this rich critic, Sidney Wallace, will like his stuff, at least enough to buy Burke out at a profit. And, Sidney is impressed and certainly, interested in seeking a buyout scenario for Burke. But he's going to be away for 3 months in Egypt funding some excavations there. Now, that 3-month wait is more than Burke is willing to wait. So Burke would like to commit insurance fraud. He thinks, well, we could we could set this place on fire and split the $25,000 insurance payout between the two of them. And despite protests, Burke begins setting Jared's wax sculptures on fire. And the two men fight, and Burke leaves the museum to burn, with Jared to die in the fire, so that basically Burke can have all of the $25,000 for himself. Now, Professor Jared was thought to have died in the building fire because the building also exploded because Burke left a gas line open for, like the various candle lights that you could have inside of the building. He left all of those gas lines open, so it did explode the building. And Burke, after some struggle, because they never did find Jared's body, finally settles with the insurance company, and he plans on getting away on a trip with his girlfriend, Kathy. Now, Kathy's played by Carolyn Jones of Addams Family fame. A few years later, she would ultimately be nominated for an Oscar, too, for another film. But later, a disfigured man kills Burke and then stages it to appear to be a suicide by hanging. The disfigured man then attacks and kills Kathy while she was sleeping, or at least makes it look like that she had died while she was sleeping, but was unable to recreate the suicide scene the way he planned because Kathy's roommate, Sue, interrupts, causing her to run away to find help, and which causes the disfigured man to chase after her and eventually lose track of her while she finds a friend of hers, Scott. Now later, after Kathy's body is taken to the morgue, the disfigured man is already there waiting for them to bring the body in and place it into the storage room in the morgue. He finds Kathy's body and basically absconds with it with the help of his assistants, Igor, a deaf mute, and a man named Leon, an alcoholic. At some point later, Sidney Wallace responds to a letter from Professor Jared. Now, Wallace believed Jared was dead and thought that this was maybe some sort of joke, but here Jared is in a wheelchair and with scarred hands, basically unsuitable to be a sculptor. So Jared tells Wallace that he plans to reopen a wax museum, but this time with crimes of violence being depicted, while the stories of these crimes that he is recreating are still fresh in the public's mind. He wants people to be terrified and then go out into the street and tell others how wonderful it is to feel scared to death by these depictions. And Jared tells Wallace that his new process for creating these statues is that he has a body created by plaster of Paris, which is what I believe Leon does. And then that is covered in wax before having their hands attached after being created in another technique of the good professor's creation. And then he shows that he has quote unquote recreated the man whose face was in all the papers some weeks ago from a hanging in an elevator shaft. That is Matthew Burke. Now, sometime later, Jared's new house of wax is open to much fanfare. He has a Hall of Fame and a Chamber of Horrors. Now, while Jared does recreate some historical figures, they are all figures who were killed or murdered in infamous ways. And among the attendees on opening night are Scott and Sue. Scott himself is a sculptor, and Sue models for him kind of unofficially. Scott is also good friends with Wallace. And while they're all talking, Sue is shocked to see that the wax figure of Joan of Arc has an uncanny resemblance to her now deceased friend Kathy. Jared explains that he saw pictures of Kathy in the newspaper and used her likeness for Joan of Arc. And Sue even says that Kathy wouldn't have minded because she used to always like to dress up and act like characters that they saw in plays. Jared takes an interest in Scott and wants to work with him. And he comments on how Sue looked just like his previous wax figure, his prized possession, Marie Antoinette. And he hopes to someday recreate her with Sue standing in as model. Now, Sue is still concerned over how much Joan of Arc really looks like Kathy, and she tells both Scott and the police that it seems kind of impossible that Jared would have spotted one very distinctive thing from seeing a picture of her in a newspaper. There was a very distinct ear piercing on Kathy's right ear. If you knew her as well as Sue did, then you might know that fact, but not as a stranger just simply looking at photographs. The detective trying to find Kathy's killer, Brennan, mentions that a man in a wheelchair like Jared's came in and asked for photos of Kathy, so maybe he really is telling the truth. But following up on Sue's story about the House of Wax, Brennan and his partner Shane start noticing the likenesses of all the people depicted at the museum, and they all look like real people that have been in the paper. And they ask Leon about how they got the likenesses, and he says from photographs. And they soon discover that Leon is an assumed name for a former convict known for his artistic talents. In fact, he drew a recreation of the Last Supper on his cell wall that was so good that they let him out of prison over it. But when they pick Leon up, they notice that he has a gold pocket watch on his person belonging to a missing attorney. And after learning that Sue is going to meet Scott at the Wax Museum, Jared sends Scott away on an errand so that he's not there when she arrives at the darkened museum. And Sue, taking the opportunity, thinking that she's alone, lifts the dark hair off the statue of Joan to see Kathy's blonde hair underneath, confirming her suspicion that Kathy's dead body is actually under the wax. Jared stands up out of his wheelchair and chases Sue through the museum. He grabs her and she starts hitting his face, causing a wax mask to crumble off his face, revealing he was the disfigured man who killed Kathy all this time. Sue faints and Jared begins to prepare wax to cover her as his new Marie Antoinette. Now, at the police station, Leon, a.k.a. Carl Hendricks, confesses that Jared survived this fire, but he was driven mad by it. Everyone in the museum doesn't just look like someone, but it is actually them. The whole place is a morgue. And the police rush to save Sue before she is covered in wax, while Scott and Igor have a fist fight in the museum. And Igor plans to put Scott into the guillotine that's on display at the museum, but the police arrive and stop Igor before Scott's killed, and they're able to get into the cellar to stop Jared. A policeman punches Jared into the vat of hot wax, while Brennan pulls Sue out of the way of the machine that's going to spray the hot wax down onto her. And so with that, let's mold ourselves 3 things that I like about this movie. First, the 3D element is pretty fun here. I mean, the most famous scene is the carnival barking showman with the paddle balls. He's the guy who's basically there right after intermission, kind of welcoming everybody to the brand new wax museum. Not only is he coming in hot with a pair of these paddles with balls flying all over the place, he then turns to the camera and hits the ball on the stretchy string right towards the camera. He's even looking down the barrel of the camera lens to speak to the movie theater audience himself. I mean, he even comments on someone eating popcorn as if he's talking directly to somebody in the theater, and threatening to knock the popcorn out of the guy's fingers. It's just charming. I mean, just to get another dose of the guy after the scene inside the wax museum, we come right back to him where he continues to hit the ball straight at the camera for the 3D effects and speak to the movie audience. It's such a silly thing and very quaint, but in the early days of this 3D gimmick, it was all part of the price of admission. You get a spooky story and you get some cheap thrills by way of a paddle ball. Now, second, I have a lot to say about Price's very sympathetic turn, at least sympathetic in the earlier parts of the movie as Professor Jared. But before we get there, this is a movie that is kind of surprisingly full of sad people. I mean, Burke is, well, a jerk who is obsessed with investing money, and he's always trying to turn as much of a profit as possible. He doesn't really seem to care about his business partner's talent. He doesn't really care about Kathy. Sue and Kathy are poor and just trying to find a better life. Kathy's constantly trying to find people who are, she can kind of marry up and get money from, basically, or at least live a better life with. But Sue can't, she's trying to find work and can't find any, and is nearly homeless because she can't pay the meager rent that she owes. It's even implied that she goes hungry too, because Kathy gives her last 50 cents so that Sue can eat before Kathy goes out on a date where she knows she will eat well. And Kathy is killed by Jared for being nothing more than associated with Burke. I mean, I don't see any reason why Jared intended to kill her otherwise. But then you also have Charles Bronson, who is in a very early role for him playing the deaf-mute assistant Igor. I mean, he's kind of a sympathetic character in some ways, who is likely just always viewed as being kind of deaf and dumb, or possibly even threatening, because he doesn't show any, they mention a couple of times that he's not being he's not being insensitive. He just doesn't have the manners because he can't hear or speak. So I'm sure that is not something that is easy to live with in 1902. But another assistant of Jared's is a boozer. I mean, these are all characters who have flaws or unfortunate situations. I mean, it's surprising how even in a horror film, a 1953 studio mainstream movie this is not necessarily an Oscar winner. This is not a movie that's going to be a hard-hitting drama. This was a movie that was meant to be consumed by a mainstream audience full of people who are into horror, but they blatantly feature sad sacks in this roster of characters. It just adds a little more depth to this movie's plot and story. And like I said, because Andre de Toth couldn't see in 3D to understand what he was shooting, he did spend a lot more time on these types of characters and their kind of sad sack dispositions. But thirdly, Vincent Price is fantastic in this movie. Price was kind of languishing in smaller roles in the 30s and 40s. This movie made Price a new powerhouse in horror on the level of Lugosi, Karloff, and Lon Chaney Jr. from decades earlier. After this film's release, Vincent Price would remain a sought-after actor for horror films, mad scientist roles, and other deranged or just kind of off-center characters for the rest of his life. He would go on to live almost 40 more years and remain in highly regarded and in high demand for the rest of that time. But this movie does something more for Price than the macabre stuff that you typically think of him doing. In the early stages of this movie, he's quite sensitive. I mean, he talks to his wax figures, and kind of has a sympathetic tone to him. Price's softer way of speaking, despite also having a very recognizable and almost, there is a strength in that soft tone that he had when he speaks. is one of his great qualities, and it plays very well throughout this movie. He is an artist who loves his work. Sure, he goes a little crazy, I suppose, but you know what? I kind of don't blame him, you know? I mean, but anyway, this is a really great role, and one he'll always be remembered for, and for very, very good reason. Price is just phenomenal and extremely engaging in this. And this is required viewing for any fan of classic horror or of Vincent Price. And honestly, you might be required to name this movie the best of all of his works, just for the prestige he gained and earned from this role. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast on Wednesday mornings as well as Monster Mondays on Monday afternoons at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload this stuff to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, we return to Abaddon, New York for a second trip to the Hell House in Hell House LLC 2, the Abaddon Hotel. Until next week, stay spooky.